Ah, we are live now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Navratri to those of you who are celebrating. And welcome to DSB International's first panel discussion of this academic year. And we are going to be looking at the subject of homework. What is the point of homework? And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our illustrious panel of guests. Firstly, I would just like to welcome Camille Gauthier, who is the head of secondary here at DSB International School. Then I would like to welcome Richard Bartlett. Richard has been a principal in Berlin and in Istanbul, and also works with DSB as an educational consultant, and more widely, he runs an educational consultancy. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Sita Murthy. Sita is the chair of the southern region of the IB heads in India. Is that correct, Sita?
Yes, right.
Yes, and is the principal, the director of education of the Silver Oaks schools in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and I can't remember where else now. Thank you very much. Cheers. Thanks a lot. I first met Sita when we both did our IB heads training together some time ago back in Delhi. Finally, all the way from the Netherlands, I'd like to welcome Anshuman Gokaldus, who is a graduate of DSB International School and is now currently studying aeronautical engineering at Delft University, one of the leading universities. And he's going to correct me, but one of the leading universities for the subject in the world.
It's aerospace. It's
aerospace, thank you. I do apologize. I get it wrong every time. So, and it isn't just to annoy him, it is just my age, I think. Anyway, so what we would like to do this evening is just sort of like open up some ideas to discuss around homework and to share some experiences. And certainly Sita has done a huge amount of work about how to make homework meaningful. We at DSB are certainly exploring what we feel we would like homework to be and what it looks like. Anshuman will be sharing some experiences of somebody who still has to do homework and possibly helping us reflect on what it was like when he was at school. And Richard has done some interesting things around homework in his time as a school leader and has, I think, some other very valid perspectives if you look at homework as part of a holistic education program. Now, I have to now sort of flick to my crib sheet, so I will now look like I'm reading rather than actually talking directly at the camera. But I would like to start off, I think, really, with a question. Does homework contribute to learning, and how do we know this? So, Cami, would you like to start this question, please?
Sure. Well, I guess it's a thorny issue, and I think this is probably a question that we're going to try and answer over the course of all of tonight. So I'm not going to claim to have an answer for you straight away, because otherwise we can all switch off and go to bed. I mean, certainly, I think we'll have to differentiate between homework in primary and homework in secondary. I'm not particularly qualified to talk about homework in primary, and I think this is perhaps a question we can ask Richard later on. But certainly, I think in primary, homework is meaningful and homework does contribute to learning. It is an important part of the educational journey of the students. And I think certainly the research around homework does evidence that homework, when done right, is very meaningful. And I think perhaps the crux of the question is not so much does homework contribute to learning, but more, how do we make sure that we set the right type of homework so it does contribute to learning? I think as a school leader, I regularly have parents who will reach out to me and tell me, Miss Cami, there's far too much homework for my child. And in the next email or in the next telephone conversation, I have another parent in the same class saying, Miss Cami, please do not give homework. And so you get both sides of the expectations, people who want more and people who don't want any. And as a school, I think it's trying to find the right balance and make sure that the homework that is given is does contribute to learning. And I think perhaps, as I said, we redirect the conversations towards how do we make it meaningful. So I will hand that back to you, Howard, so you can perhaps pass that question on.
Yes, certainly. So I know in my sort of discussions with Sita, you have said that you've done a huge amount of work around this subject of making sure it is home learning rather than just homework. And you've got a lot of criteria in your school, and you've got a long story about how you have made what you believe is a much more meaningful thing from homework. So would you please explain the process that you've been through and what your aspirations are and how you got there?
Sure, Howard. It's a pleasure sharing my perspectives on what's the point of homework. So I think I'll start with this thing of we need to change the narrative around homework, because right now it is pitched at a very different level and not a very good place to be honest about it. Okay. How we worked on it is first demystifying what is this hype around homework. If you really observe, students suffer with a victim complex when they get homework. Parents have a persecution complex because they have to remind the children to complete the work. And teachers have a martyr's complex, to be honest, because out of let's say 20, 25 students in a class, 3 to 4 of them don't do it. And the teachers feel immensely bad about the whole thing that 4 children have not done. So there is something that we need to demystify about the hype around homework. We also need to reinterpret the narrative. That's where we have done a lot of work in our schools, because what I mean to say by reinterpreting the narrative is homework is not a task that we give children just because it's a ritual of a school's routine. No, homework is more about continuity of work, practice, extended practice of work. And of course, there are multiple other things, layers to it, wherein I feel that we have to do a lot of study about what kind of relevant, significant, engaging, challenging work can we give to the students and how meaningful can it be to them. So I think I'd like to start the discussion with all of us need to reinterpret the narrative around the homework. And I certainly believe that it is necessary because it builds a learning culture. It builds a responsibility in the learner that this is my work and I need to work on building a culture of responsibility. I think that's where I'd like to start the conversation with Howard.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Anshuman, I don't want to give too much away, but you perhaps weren't the greatest fan of homework when you were younger. But now I think you have some very strong opinions about the value of homework. So would you like to just talk us through a little bit about what you think, how homework is useful and what type of homework is useful?
In my experience, homework is always a little bit of something that you don't want to do because it cuts into time that ostensibly should be free. But coming to college, I've learned that sometimes that you literally don't have enough time sometimes as a teacher to instill the knowledge that you need to. And so students do need to go home and internalize it for themselves. This is true, especially true in the college classes that I am taking part in. We have 6 hours of lectures a week. Most of my time is spent doing homework because there's 439 other kids doing the same degree. You physically cannot individually teach each and every one of them, and homework is the only way to do that. And schools need to teach students how to do homework as a skill unto itself, I think. Of course, that's not to say that schools should be having students do the equivalent of digging dishes and filling them back up again. But you obviously need to do something at home. But it's not I don't know how to make good, effective homework. I'm not going into pedagogy. I'm going into something else. But that has at least been my experience so far.
Thank you very much, Anjuman. Yeah, I think we probably all agree that we don't want to make kids dig ditches, but actually that is very much what a large amount of homework across the world, not just in India here, but across the world, is children doing a certain amount of measurable work in a certain amount of time, which has about as much value to their education as if we had sent them outside to dig ditches. So, Richard, what is your feeling about homework? As Anshuman said, very, very important there. Now he's doing his aerospace engineering degree. Obviously, Sita's done a lot of work around how to make it meaningful. She certainly wants to be breaking paradigms around this. What's your perspective? You're on mute.
I wouldn't want to argue with Anshuman that homework is necessary at university level if you only have 6 hours of classes a week. And in the upper years of the senior school, I think that is a good training and preparation, if you like. But really, those last 2 years is enough. To have 14 years of education and 2 hours a night of homework is a very long training program to learn how to study. So I don't think that's good enough for doing it. I think we need a paradigm, if you like, shift around education, not just homework. Because if we look, where did homework come from? I don't think anyone knows. But my guess in England and India is it came from England. It probably came from the public schools that were all boarding schools. And in the boarding schools, the kid went to school in the day and then the teachers had to deal with them in the evening. What better way? Set them homework. And then when the day schools moved into the educational process, they got their ideas from the boarding schools. Let's set homework. And that's, I think, where it may have come from. So do we need this exact amount of hours in a day and this exact amount of information and things we learn to prepare for adulthood? And it's funny that it doesn't fit into an 8-hour school day or a 7-hour school day, but it needs exactly 1 or 2 or 3, depending on what country in the world you are, hours extra to reach that critical mass. And that, I think, is probably not borne out by any research. So I'm very skeptical of that indeed. And the most important thing, I think, for any parents is, why do parents like homework? Because they love their children and want to do the very best. And that's what they think is the best way of doing it. That's what they did. That's what their parents did. Hey, that's what you're going to do. But the opportunity cost of younger children doing homework is massive, even if it does increase and add to a little bit of the school learning. If you take away the hours of school for the kids, if you take away the time they're asleep, if you take away the time in many private schools they're traveling on buses, how much time does that leave? Not a lot. It actually, as a percentage of the time it leaves, is far less than for the adults in most cases. So we're asking more of our young children than actually us as adults are working in our own lives. And it takes away the opportunities to do things spontaneous, to do things constructive, to do things from a self-desire rather than an imposed desire, to explore, to find new meanings, to learn a musical instrument, become really good at a sport or art. These are the talents that it denies the opportunity to because of the time constraints. So when I speak a bit against homework, if you like, I'm actually speaking on behalf of perhaps some of the students, not just because they don't like homework, but because I think particularly the younger ones are losing a lot by homework, more than they actually gain. And the parents, well, they just end up in needless fights as the children get older. Do you really want to spend your time doing that? I'm not so sure myself.
Okay, thank you very much. So some interesting early sort of like pointers as to where the conversation can go. What I would just like to say to all of the attendees is that they are welcome to write any questions into the Q&A. Yes, so, you know, and I would like to give people in the audience an opportunity to question the panelists a bit further. So moving on, I think we've looked at the fact that homework is something which is obviously important. We've also looked at the fact, I certainly think I agree with Richard, is that it's eating away into time which can be usefully used for other things. I have a student who I sat there working out her schedule around her many hours of gymnastic training a week, and we reckon she had about 3 hours somewhere on a Sunday morning where she could realistically do homework on the grounds that I insisted that she needed to give herself time to eat during the week. So, you know, we do need to think quite carefully about these things. Now, so Sita, one of the things that I think we all agree is that homework is no point unless you're actually learning. What do you think are the key things that can tell you if you feel that a teacher is setting homework that is going to create learning? And I mean, I know you've looked a lot at this. You've got a lot of structure here.
So how I look at it, Howard, is that homework is also like an agency, a learner's agency, okay? Like how Cami said in the beginning of the conversation, what it means to early years children, primary children, middle school children is different from what it can mean to the senior school children, okay? Some of the things that we looked at was during school hours, there are so many other things that we can give, like the social skills, thinking skills, and, you know, maybe even communication skills. And earlier days, we used to have, you know, early years children practicing even the handwriting or letter writing or improving upon their handwriting or number names and things like that, which at one level can actually be very mechanical too. They're just repetitive. Those are the things that we felt should be shifted to home task, so that, you know, what we do in the school, where children can gain a lot from the group interactions. That's how we started looking at meaningful planning of assigning work at home, where when the child sits alone at home, maybe with the support of a parent, can continue to do it. So oftentimes we have seen transferring some of the repetitive things like for example, handwriting or spellings and things like that. We moved it to homework. When it came to PYP, the older students in grades 4, 5, 6, a lot of inquiry. You know, sometimes student-led inquiries need a lot of time. That is where we felt when a student has a desire to lead one's own inquiry, the student needs time. I'm talking about independent inquiries, not the group inquiries. So that is one more task that we felt should be assigned as homework. When it comes to MYP, you know very well, the personal project requires plenty of time for the student to even delve upon his own question. What do I want to inquire into? These are the kind of things, like in DP, you have the extended essay and the TOK. Trust me, one has to, I'm sure you know better than me, about how much of time a student has to invest in understanding his own question and inquiring upon it, making logic and rational. And these are the things that need extensive, exclusive, private time for the student. We looked at assigning these things as home task time instead of just because it's a ritual. So the student also has to do a homework, also a personal project, also something and also something. I think that is expecting too much from a student. So the kind of things we did was rationalizing, bringing some logic into it, planning their time, like how Dishart said that in these urban settings that we all live in, travel time itself takes away plenty of energy for children. So we need to be very thoughtful about how much time do they really have and how will it transfer into extended learning. So these are the things that we put into action in our school. But at the end of it, after all this, also we do tell students, this is your responsibility. We understood all these other areas, and still we are giving scope for you to work on your extended learning. So you need to find time, make time, because I don't want a teacher to chase you whether you submitted your work or not. I don't want a parent to mollycoddle you into doing your work. It's your work you have to do. So end of it, somewhere we also looked at It should be a personal responsibility of a student, whatever may be the age, but it is not the parent or the teacher who should be more concerned about it. So that's how we looked at it, as homework is for the child and not for the parent or the teachers. No.
That's a very interesting one, because of course we all get the, will you tell me if my child's not done homework? Well, possibly if I get through the other 101 things that I have to do in my life, I might do, yes. But yeah, so I'd like to come back to that a bit, about the consequences of not doing homework and our responsibility as school leaders. You know, you talk about agency and choice. Do we create an environment that gives agency and choice? I'd like to come back to that. But yeah, Cami, I was just wondering, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that regular practice is a very important part of learning. There's this term that they use in England, shed loads of practice, or slop, as it's often sort of changed to. But does that mean that we're expecting the child to do 50 sets of conjugations of French verbs of an evening? Or can we be more imaginative about shed loads of practice, which I suspect, as Sita says, is something that we don't want to be invigilating in our classroom all the time? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, my position as a language teacher is that if you're going to ever be able to speak a language, you've got to, first of all, commit quite a lot of vocabulary and grammar to memory, which is not necessarily the most exciting part about languages, and practice, practice, practice. That's the only way you learn a language, especially in a classroom setting where you're not immersed in the language environment. So for sure, in my subject, I feel that especially as you go into the older year groups, setting homework is incredibly important, because with 4 lessons a week, students don't have time to commit to memory the stuff that they need to commit to memory in order to be able to be proficient in the language. I'd like to share an approach that I had a few years ago with a class that was very, very successful, and that we are revisiting at the moment as we review our home learning policy. I think it was in grade 7 or grade 8, I had actually offered or had posted a takeaway menu card, a takeaway homework card. So rather than assign specific homeworks, I had given them a very long list of possible tasks that could be adapted to whatever context we were doing. So whichever grammar rule we had just discovered, whichever topic, whichever set of vocabulary we had just covered. So it was a very flexible approach, and the students could choose which task they wanted to do with relation to the topic we were doing at that point of time. They could also identify either a past topic that they had not quite, or that they needed work on, or they could identify future topics that they'd like to get a head start on. So the takeaway menu was structured in such a way that there was a lot of student agency, there was a lot of choice, and it was putting the ownership on the students rather than on me. Now the task was still set. There was still a requirement that by the end of the week they had chosen a task, and that they would present me with what they had learned. And what I saw, I mean, it was a particularly able year group, but certainly that generated a lot of buzz, and kids were actually excited. You know, I posted it was literally in the form of a menu, and it had French words and stuff. It was fancy, but they'd go up to the board and go, "Oof, what am I going to do today?" And I think learning is meaningful when it's buzzing, when it's alive, and when it's dynamic. And I think that was certainly a good way to engage kids with homework whilst giving them the ownership of how they wanted to do that. Now, if I can bring you, so that was a few years ago, and we are revisiting this today in the context of rewriting a home learning policy rather than homework. And we had a meeting with our learning leaders or our subject leaders where we said, okay, so let's revisit how we do this. Let's try and make it meaningful, because we realized we were facing more and more issues of kids not really doing the work, turning up, not being prepared. So we looked at the kind of homework that we did deliver, and we looked at what we felt was meaningful. And we were now in the process of generating something similar to the takeaway homework menu card that I had done for my class, where we have a home learning document, which is subject specific and year group specific. So Once it's put together, hopefully in the next week or so, the student will have a PDF document with each of the subjects that they study and a list of tasks that they can access to either reinforce learning or further their learning. And again, the idea is that those tasks are set. It's not a free-for-all. It's not, if you fancy doing homework, here's what you can do, because I think we've all worked with teenagers. If they have the choice between doing that or going to play football with their friends, they're probably going to play football with their friends, which is perfectly reasonable way to spend an evening, but perhaps not when you have a French test the following week and you do need to revise. So the task is set, it is monitored, there is an expectation that it is submitted, but there is a focus on student ownership, student agency, and we try and make it inspiring, because at the end of the day, the students get to choose what they want to do and how they deliver it with guidance. So hopefully this is something that works well.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So, yeah, I think the subject of what do you do when kids don't do it is an interesting one. Richard, have you got any thoughts on that, on compliance and what's the other word I'm looking for? What happens if you don't do it? Yeah.
Well, that's one of the problems of homework per se. And when one talks of agency, it's not really agency. If you say to someone, I'm going to cut one of your fingers off. Now, you can choose, you can take responsibility. Is it going to be the little finger or the thumb on the other hand? That is not agency. Agency is when they have the power and the control to make decisions of their own life, I would say. If you have situations where children are being forced into homework and it's very often dull and uninteresting. Right, we hear from Cami that it doesn't always have to be, and that's great if you're going to have homework to make it interesting. But it's a huge problem for parents and for teachers of actually dragging homework out of reluctant kids. And that is also a terrible waste of time. It's a terrible waste of relationships for parents and teachers. And it makes me think again, is it really worth it for the outcome? And I'm very suspicious. So the idea of the punishing the kids, which was the word you were looking for, Howard, and couldn't remember, for not making the decision that you've actually made for them already by saying you have to make this decision, it's not really their choice at all, seems somewhat unfair and is going to lead to problems for you. So it is also very often inequitable. Even if you had homework, it's often task related. You know, read one chapter. Terrible way, a good way of putting kids off reading, by the way, make them read a book they're not interested in, or do 10 arithmetic calculations. So that's actually, if you like, a tax on less able kids. Some kids will breeze through whatever it is in a moment, and others are going to take 2 hours to do it. So just because the kid's a bit more intellectually challenged, why are you punishing them by making them do more homework or punishing them when they don't do the homework that you've set? So in terms of this consequences, if you like, of not doing it, well, make it voluntary and then you won't have to deal with the consequences or the punishment.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I mean, I actually spent most of my early years teaching in schools where I could be pretty certain the vast majority of kids were never going to do any homework. So it did mean that I had to ensure that most of the learning took place in the classroom. I mean, it also meant that you certainly couldn't plan with the assumption that people would have prepared anything. But they did learn. There was learning happening. Anshuman, I know you don't want to be drawn into conversations about pedagogy, but what sort of carrots do you think, rather than sticks, might work for the more resistant learner?
Well, right now, for me, I think what's happening is that you have to do the homework for for one of my university courses. You have to do 80% of the homework, or you can't give the exam, so you fail the course. I think that, like, that's, from my perspective, that's perfectly satisfactory. Like, do it or suffer the consequences, right? Because it's about instilling knowledge. But I think in terms of maybe homework where it's not the bulk of the learning, I think it might be better to just like the problem is that if you propose any academic like any academic rewards, it's not going to get the people who wouldn't normally do homework to do it. Like if you're not doing homework, you're not going to be tempted by extra academics, right? Um, and simultaneously, any other rewards seem bizarre to come from school, right? Like I can't see schools using game theory to win like oh the hearts and minds of students. Like I don't think schools should engineer an organic way of having like the prisoner's dilemma occur. I think that maybe if a kid is like ultimately resistant to doing homework, then maybe it's just fine to say that they've dug their own like that they've made their own bed. Is the response I would give you because like I can't really think of a way to um, effectively motivate children who don't want to do homework into doing homework in a way that I'm comfortable with.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to pause there momentarily and remind people if they'd like to put any questions into the Q&A, please do so. And I think what Anshuman has just said segues nicely into my next question for you, Sita, which is, okay, how do you produce a culture where kids want to do their homework? And I suppose want to do it for the right reasons, perhaps. There's a bit more of a challenge. Oh, you're on mute.
While listening to the others, you know what was going on in my mind? I remembered this book, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about in paddy growing countries, the general tradition is 10,000 hours is one thing. The other thing is waking up early morning from 4 o'clock to 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Long working hours is a tradition and a culture in most of the paddy growing countries. How Malcolm Gladwell interpreted that social interpretation that he gave was, parents are okay if their children are spending long hours at a study table, reading, writing, practicing, reading, writing, practicing. They're okay with that idea. Over a period of time, people started believing schooling means long hours in the school, coming back home, long hours with the homework, and then studying, and then just about half an hour of television, maybe a little play here and there, and things like that. So this had become a formula for quite some time, at least in India, I can tell you that. Okay. So if I have to take that formula and start looking at it, there are 90% of the parents who are very happy with homework. There are 10% of them who feel it should not be too much. In fact, many parents, those parents don't know what is too much or what is too less also. Okay. If I have to start talking from there, you will also have children who may need a stick or who may need a carrot. Just like in our differentiated instruction, there are some children who learn like this and some children who respond like that. Even a home task, we need to understand the needs of the children and accordingly discuss with them, clarify expectations. Like I think initially Anshuman said, schools have to train children into understanding how to do a homework. For me, assigning a homework is not something that a child does not know how to do it, but assigning a homework is more about the child wanting to practice more because I need to learn this a little more. Okay, like how Camille said about language, so is the case with mathematics. There are some parts of mathematics which require extended hours of practice, but all these have to be assigned only after a clear discussion about we are doing this for your sake. In my earlier perspective that I shared, you said you will come back to me about responsibility. Now this is where I'm coming to. We try our best to get students on board, explaining to them as to why we are giving this, And we tell parents repeatedly, we don't want you to chase your children at home to do the homework. We will never call you if your child does not do the homework. It's between us and your children. Please don't come into the picture at all. Because if the children get used to the idea that either the teacher or the parent will chase us for the homework, you begin to dislike it. Children begin to dislike the entire activity called homework. So that's the first thing we started telling parents, you don't get into the picture. Second thing we told the teachers is, don't chase children for the submission of the work. Over a period of time, we want children to develop that responsibility that I want to get a feedback from teacher for what I have learned. I want to know where I still have to work more. It took some time, trust me, because these are all things that are attached to a culture of thinking and doing and practicing. But this is something we've been doing for 15 years, I must say. And last 10 years, homework has been the last point of concern for any teacher, because we could build that culture in students that, and there are no punishments, there are no reviews, there's nothing like that. But we do tell children that be honest. When you can't do something, come back and tell us. And we also have democracy in homework. Student is at a free will to choose which part of the subject or which subject he or she wants to practice on, and because they couldn't get it the right way in the class. So there is some democracy there. There is some self-responsibility there. And there is some demystifying it by telling the parents that you don't get into picture. It's between us and your children. So this is how we have been building a new narrative around the entire thing called homework. Yeah, I think this is how we've been doing.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, because there's some very radical things you've said there, really. The idea that, firstly, I think, and I have to say I agree with you, it's nothing to do with the parents. This is a conversation between us and our students. They have plenty of other responsibilities as parents without this being one of them. But also, the fear of just letting kids go and eventually they'll start to make the right decisions, which really, if they don't, then that's where we're failing, rather than the not doing the homework. The failing is that we are not, over these years of having these children, nurturing them into young adults who make the right decisions.
Right, yeah.
So
between controlling and enabling, that's where we work. We don't want a stick for it, but we want them to feel that the carrot is your own empowerment. It's not like you get a certificate for doing your work. Nobody gets a certificate for doing their work. So that's how we started demystifying the entire narrative.
So we do live in a very, very competitive country where higher education is a limited resource, and there is a huge amount of competition to get there, and there is very well understood routes how to get you there, which I imagine for you is a big tension in running your school, and is something that we have to battle with as well. Do we need to take a step back and ask a question, what is the good of all these really, really high grades that are achieved? Cami, what do you think?
Well, I think as long as we work within a system that has as an outcome a university which will look at your predicted grades or your exam grades as the sole reason for saying, yes, we'll have you, or no, sorry, we won't have you, then we're stuck in an endless cycle. I know some universities are changing the way they go about admissions. Certainly, I think the four of us educators here know perfectly well that throughout our careers, and mine has been relatively short, but I'm sure you will know that too, the students who have been the most successful are not necessarily the ones who had the highest grades, or indeed who went to the better universities. So I think we need to refocus learning and therefore teaching around preparing kids for life, and life is not exams. And I know that I've noticed that Belen in the chat mentioned homework as a complement for education, but also establishing the habit of work. Now, I think Richard will tell you don't need to practice doing homework for 14 years before you've developed that skill. But I would probably agree that towards the end of your secondary education, as you go into a life which will require you to be independent and to be driven and to say, well, tonight I have to file my taxes, but nobody's going to give me a deadline. Well, the government's going to give me a deadline, but mummy and daddy are not going to be reminding me, or I have to get that project to my boss, or I have to get that quote out to the client. So perhaps homework has a small part in supporting students to kind of develop the skills for independent life. But certainly when it comes to doing homework so you can get a good grade, well, we go back to, are grades the only way you can evidence learning? Are grades the only way you can evidence success? Are they the best way you can evidence learning? And at the moment, the answer is, well, it doesn't matter because we don't have a choice. It doesn't matter. Well, the question is almost irrelevant as long as universities will say, well, I will take you if you have 35 points.
Yes. We live in a country where a lot of people get 99.9% averages. Is there any evidence it's doing our country any good? I think, Mr. Bartlett, what do you think about this race for marks and just the more general well-being of the person it's learning?
Well, a lot of what Cami said, I would certainly agree with there. And certainly in the real world we live in, there's no shortcut. For the older students and IB students particularly, they simply have to do whatever is required, and it's up to them how much they do to get the outcome they want. And that's the current system for it. Looking at it a little bit more sort of broadly, it's the benefit to a country or to an individual is probably based on their potential, not on their past. And as we've noticed, it's not always the kids who get the top grades at school who then become the great successes in life in many different fields. So a better way of identifying potential is more important than looking at the past achievements, perhaps. But that's a slightly different topic. And quite a challenging one. The grades, well, yeah, I wish there was a better way of doing it. But if someone gets 99.9%, I am somewhat suspicious. Who is this person marking this piece of work that is so wonderfully attuned to excellence they can discriminate to 1/1000th of a point? I don't think that's actually a very realistic approach to doing it. If we had several hours, I would happily set up alternative systems for you in probably alternative universities as well that would not involve homework and would involve more genuine agency. But I think for the purposes of our talk today, where I am perhaps coming less favourably towards homework, is very much at the lower end of the age group. And at the risk of repeating, it really is that opportunity cost of, even if you give them homework and allow them what to choose from a menu, you're still saying it's French. What you're not saying is it's any book you want to read on the universe. It's not saying it's any musical instrument or any language you want to read or any sport you want to become excellent at. It's still proscribing certain things and prescribing others. And is education in the homework so essential? Well, just anecdotally for 1 second, I've got two kids who are both successful, I'm pleased to say, professional or whatever. They went to the same school, they had the same teachers, and they did the same classes pretty much. One of them spent 5 hours a night on homework and went to bed in tears because they hadn't finished. And the other came home every day and said, no, we don't have anything today, every single day of the week. Ultimately, they both made their own ways in life, but one of them did an awful lot more homework than the other.
Yes, interesting, isn't it? Anshuman, as a younger person, you were perhaps not the greatest enthusiast for homework, but you did quite a lot of learning. You knew a lot about a lot of things. What do you think perhaps that was more useful to you? I don't know. I just wondered, now from your position at university, what would you say were the things that were most useful to you in your learning journey up to here?
I think what was most useful to me was like school. I may have realized that I had an interest in what I have because of what I did outside, but nothing I did, like none of the knowledge, and it is just knowledge, it's not critical thinking. None of the information I got on my own time has materially helped me, like, any meaningful way. I've been doing well so far because I paid attention in my university lectures. What I know from outside of school was basically just enabled me to see something that was said in lecture and realize, hey, I know that. I've heard that name before. But it's not the entire thing is that tough concepts are not fun to learn. No one's gonna use their spare time to do things that are difficult. Like, not as interesting as other things and difficult. There's nobody queuing up to learn about the intricacies of as an example, like the aerodynamics of a wing surface, despite that, like, nominally being able to say that, like, it's pretty cool. But the actual useful knowledge is not something that people will voluntarily want to learn. It's something that, at least in my experience, you have to learn by instruction, by like having to make yourself do it. I think that, yeah, definitely, I was not a huge fan of homework when I was in school, but that's because I was a child, and children are generally not as wise as the people they seem to criticize. Diplomatically phrased. Just that, yeah, like, fundamentally, the argument is just that, yeah, kids are gonna dislike homework, but kids are wrong. Like, you have to do it because anything worth learning is difficult, time consuming, and ultimately boring at some point. You have to work through that. And homework is a very good lesson, a very good way of learning that, I think.
Interesting, an interesting way of looking at things. I've noticed there's not many questions in the audience. Is this because the audience is all agreeing with us that homework really does need to be seriously reconsidered? Because everything we're talking about here is not the norm. The norm for homework, and I'm not just talking about it in an Indian context, I think it would be pretty true in the United Kingdom as well, is homework by weight. Take home this worksheet and fill it in. Where, Mr. Bartlett, did most of your worksheets get completed when you were a schoolboy?
I don't remember actually doing any particularly, except occasionally if I got to school 10 minutes before school started, if the bus was on time, then I would simply copy off someone who'd actually done their homework. The teachers didn't usually notice, and if they did, they probably didn't care because it was too much of a hassle to fight me over it.
Yeah, and I think that is true for most people's experience of homework most of the time. And in this day and age, you can just copy large chunks off various things. So perhaps we're not talking here about 17-year-olds engaging with their sort of IB geography, but we're talking about 13, 14-year-olds just chunking through stuff. And most teachers realizing that they can weigh their homework on how many pieces of paper we've got in. Oh, well, I've done quite well. Most of the class has got their homework in. We can put a mark in the box and things. Give the kids homework that they can either do or reasonably copy off somebody else without causing too much trouble. So a lot of what we're talking about is quite challenging and new, and certainly a lot of the stuff that Sita said was very radical, and Cami and I know we're really trying to explore how we can make our homework more meaningful. So I'm interested. So somebody has asked a good question, and I'm going to let more wise people than me answer it. What does the science or research say in regard to homework, benefit or not? Good question. Thank you very much. Who would like to take that? I suspect everybody's read something about this. Sita?
So maybe not exactly homework, but I do hear the alumni when they come back talking about which part of the learning or practice helped them crack the competitive exams or do better in the university or deal with the project that they are handling right now. Oftentimes, I hear that when they have done consistent practice on something, that helped them learn it better. So, this question is making me link to that, that there are people who believe that when they invest some time in extended practice, there is definitely an outcome which they may not connect to immediately, but when they go to university or they're working, they realize it. But I do think that though there is no research on it, but when Richard said that his two sons went to school, one of them did a lot of homework, the other didn't do so much, but both have similar lifestyle. I have this need now to do an action research within my school about the impact of homework. But I also know that there are students who are currently in the school who love homework. They just like being that, feeling that I have a responsibility, I have to do something when I go home. So I can say that there are that many people who like it. There are that many few who may not like it as much. But then it's a part of the entire, it's a necessary evil, in my opinion.
I think Anshuman's definitely of that opinion. But so, Cami, I know you've been looking at this as we've been looking at our homework policy. What does the research say?
So here I'm going to parrot what I've read,
Yes, so
because I haven't conducted the research myself. So I am going just to summarize what I have read, and perhaps Richard can add to that or tell me I'm wrong, which I'm perfectly happy to hear. Certainly, I think from the research, in particular of John Hattie, who's the research guy in education, homework in primary has zero effect. Students in primary should not be doing any homework unless that homework is pick a book, sit down and read a book that you really want to read, because reading or practicing your musical instrument or going out and kicking a football is more important than you practicing your handwriting, which you've got your entire life to practice. The research does suggest that in primary, if done well, homework, sorry?
In secondary.
Sorry, in secondary, sorry. Yeah, should get this right, really. In secondary, homework, if done well, is meaningful. Now, one could argue that, does it mean that the minute the student turns 11 and goes into grade 6, now suddenly it has this huge impact? I think it's quite progressive. And certainly, to go back to a point that I think all of us have made, is the further into your secondary schooling you go, the more important it becomes. Again, because we live under the paradigm that we have final exams to prepare for, and we can't just prepare for those exams in the few hours of school that we have. Certainly, just to go back to another piece of research that was conducted in 2010 by a gentleman called Batterot, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. He's identified that there are 5 elements that make homework meaningful, and if you can't tick these elements, you might as well not set homework. The first one is purpose. How is it meaningful in the context of their academic experience? Homework, if it's just a drill, if it's just fill in the worksheet, if it's just ticking a box to say, hey, we've given homework, is pointless. Efficiency, it shouldn't take too long, and it should involve hard thinking. So a short task that gets students thinking is important. Ownership, students should feel connected to the content, so it should provide some amount of choice. Competence, should be able to do it without the help of someone else. So I think someone somewhere in the question Q&A asked, well, are you not punishing the parents or involving the parents when you set homework? A homework task really should not involve the parents. Students should be able to do it by themselves. And the last one is inspiring. Students should be inspired. Now, that one, I can see Richard smirking. I've been teaching for 13 years. I'm not quite sure that I've ever set a piece of homework that was inspiring. And perhaps these are my own failures as a teacher, and I'm prepared to be told how to set inspiring homework.
I've got a really, really good question that's come through Facebook from, in fact, one of our former principals at DSB, and I'd like to read it to you because it's a very genuine request for some ideas from the panel. So whichever ones of you want to dive in. I'm just trying to expand it so that I can see it. So excuse me whilst I peer at my phone. So from Ed, Malaysia has had an amnesty on all lower secondary homework during the long extended lockdown and closure of schools. This was because of the long hours children were spending on their laptops during the day. Now, 5 months later, we are looking at the possibility of some classes being able to return to school in the next few weeks. This provides a unique opportunity for reflection on homework and what we should do next. What would the panel do? I'll start off with you, Richard, and then I give Sita and Cami a chance to think.
I think the language there referring to an amnesty for the students. Amnesty is when you've broken the law and you're forgiven. I think we ought to have an amnesty for administrators in primary schools who set this useless homework for the kids in the first place and say, we'll forgive you for all the things that you've done in the past, but just don't do it again. The world hasn't stopped, even though students have been working at home, and it won't stop when they don't do homework at primary at the younger age, because just touching on that previous question about the research, yes, it has meaning and can be meaningful in certain circumstances and certain age groups. But the big question that the research I've never seen touch is that opportunity cost of what the kids would have done if they hadn't have had to spend their time doing X, Y, or Z. So to our illustrious predecessor, I'd say, get rid of it in your primary school, absolutely.
Thank you, Richard. So Sita, if somebody's sort of asking you, I'd like to reset the whole agenda on homework. I think you've done that. What were your first steps?
Okay, sorry, I'm just going to have to interrupt because I have a lecture.
Okay, right, good.
So I have to leave.
I'm so glad you now turn up to them on time. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anshuman, for coming. It's been great seeing you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Howard. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Sorry, the question again, Howard.
Yeah, sorry, I apologize. Yeah. So yeah, I think Edward's looking to reset the whole agenda on homework as he brings his students in. I think he was sort of like talking more about sort of middle school students. You've tried to do this. I think you've done so. So what are the first steps to resetting the agenda so that we can get it to be meaningful and valuable?
Yeah. So I think in the last 18, 19 months, students were in front of the screen. They did a lot of work with screens. So one thing that I started doing when we started the physical school is the no screens, no technology, should be people to people. Okay. So that's the first thing we started doing in the campus. And where the homework is concerned, I think it's more about reading. Even during online schooling that we did in the last 18 months, homework has never been online. We did everything possible to make them read the novels or the books they have, reading and writing and thinking. Everything had a lot of thinking, including making stories with math, using all the operations wherever possible, including using a simple strategy called complexity scale and asking them to read something new or existing and then arrive at which of them is least complex or most complex. So we only looked at students reading and writing and discussing and thinking, but we never looked at they Googling further, searching further on screen. So that's what we did and we are doing.
Thank you. Cami, we're definitely in this place ourselves where we're really trying to think, how are we going to reset the agenda on homework? What are your first steps? What are the things you've really been doing that you would advise?
Well, I think we've had a lot of conversations around student well-being and emotional well-being and getting them, now that things are opening up again, it's not about go home and do more of the same. You know, after all I've said about the home learning documents and giving them choice and inspiring them, but certainly again for the younger year groups, it's go out, go and practice music, go and meet your friends, because you've not done that for 18 months, and the impact, the emotional impact of that is immense, and homework can wait. And I think it needs to be reintroduced very slowly. And just to finish on an anecdote, I don't know if any of you have bothered to read the BMC guidance on reopening of schools. There's an entire section on how students must submit homework. How that has anything to do with reopening schools after COVID, I do not know, but apparently the Indian government is, or the BMC rather, is taking the very strong stance that they're going back to school and homework is back on. Perhaps it needs to be reintroduced slowly.
Yeah, I think
it made me laugh.
The fact that at no point in time would opening schools not include homework, was never even there. Yeah, and I think it's perhaps good that we as educators are saying, well, perhaps it wasn't necessary to have it straight away and not for all children. So, okay, we try and stick to a very strict 1 hour for these things. So I would like to first of all thank our audience for coming along and listening to us. It has been really, really enjoyable chatting to people. It was great having Anshuman here with his perspectives. So thank you very much, Cami. Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you very much, Sita. I really enjoyed talking to you. I hope that the audience has enjoyed, as the numbers have been very, very consistent. I think everybody has stayed with us for an hour. So thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you very much. It was nice talking to you all. Thank you.
Cheers. It was good. Thanks.